All right, so today we're going to take a look at speciation, or how new species are created from existent species. And this is a really important part about evolution because at one point, all of life had a common ancestor. And from there, natural selection has created all of the diversity of species that we see. Um, and it is a very important topic to talk about because for many people, it's not readily emergent from the microevolutionary processes that we've already talked about. So the first picture is two different species of birds. So the one on the left and the one on the right are different species, even though they look extremely similar. So one of the things that we need to agree on before we talk about how different species originate or a new species originates from an ancestor is what do we define, how do we define a species? Obviously, it can't be based on how they look because these two look very similar, yet they are a different species. And so what we're going to do is use what's called the biological definition of a species. And so a species in the biological definition is a group of organisms that can breed with one another and also produce viable and fertile offspring that are also capable of breeding. So there's actually a lot of different things in there. So the two organisms have to be able to breed together. They physically have to be compatible so that they can reproduce and that their reproduction is successful so that the offspring that they have are able to grow and develop and be born, and also that the offspring that they have are fertile so that their offspring that they have are able of interbreeding with one another and producing offspring of their own. So because of this, even though they look very different, all dogs are the same species. Same species. That's because they are capable of breeding with one another and that their offspring are fertile and able to interbreed as well. That's why you get all those different cool mixes of dogs, because there's the same species and so can interbreed. However, on this left side, there's a liger, and a liger is the offspring of a lion and a tiger. Okay, lions and tigers are different species. Now, you might say, but then why do we have ligers? Well, let's take a look. We said lions and tigers are different species, but they can breed with one another and produce viable offspring. But look at the second part. It says the offspring have to be fertile that are capable of interbreeding. Ligers are sterile. They cannot interbreed with each other to produce more ligers, right? The only way to get a liger is if a lion and tiger breed together. Two ligers can't have offspring together. If they could, lions and tigers would be the same species, but they're not. So what we want to answer is how do new species originate? That is the whole goal of what's called speciation. The main idea is that populations must become isolated, not necessarily physically, but reproductive isolation is a key. That means that if you have two groups of organisms of the same species, that for prolonged periods of time they are not able to, or something is preventing them from being able to reproduce with one another, so that genetic changes in each of the populations can accumulate over time and lead to the evolution of different species. So once isolated, populations will evolve independently because there's different factors affecting both of them. So kind of the two main types of speciation are allopatric, meaning that a geographic separation uh, causes the reproductive isolation. So, for example, on this left part of the picture, this lake ended up splitting into two separate pieces. So there's a geographic, a physical barrier in between these two populations. And so over time, they can speciate. And the other type is called sympatric, where speciation occurs even without a geographical separation. Remember, geographical separation isn't what's important, it's reproductive isolation. So if that reproductive isolation is accomplished because there's a physical barrier, like a mountain or a great distance or a lake or something, that's called allopatric. And if it occurs even without a physical barrier, it's called sympatric. Okay. Within reproductive isolation, there are two kind of main types of or mechanisms of how that reproductive isolation can occur. Prezygotic, so prezygotic isolation is something that is preventing the organisms, two groups of organisms, from either even breeding together, conception from even happening. And then postzygotic, after zygote, are factors of isolation that prevent the zygote from developing into fertile offspring capable of interbreeding. And so for the rest of the time, we're kind of look at those two. So these are examples of prezygotic barriers, obstacles to mating or to fertilization if mating occurs. So something like geographic isolation, ecological isolation, when two populations um, live in niches that don't overlap, temporal isolation, so being active at different times of the day or times of the year, behavioral isolations, like two different populations of the same species of bird having slightly different songs, mechanical isolation, where physically they're not compatible, or gametic isolation. So, as an example of a geographic isolation, um, species occurring in different areas. So, for example, look at these uh, two types of mice, or not mice, sorry, of rodents, chipmunks. They were isolated by the Colorado River forming the Grand Canyon, and they ended up speciating because of a prezygotic geographical barrier. Ecological isolation. So some species may occur in the same region but not but occupy different habitats, so they don't encounter each other, right? So for example, on the right, there's two species of garter snake that one lives in the water and the other lives on land, and so they are reproductively isolated because their niches within that habitat are so different they never run into each other. Um, what led to, back to our liger example, lions and tigers becoming different species is that they can hybridize, but they don't live in the same habitats. Lions live in grasslands and tigers live in rainforests, and so they have um, no reason to ever meet. If you look at these, ecological isolation is an example of sympatric speciation. There's not a physical barrier impeding them. Temporal isolation, species that breed during different times of the day or different seasons or different years don't really mix gametes. So here are the eastern spotted skunk and the western spotted skunk. And they occupy the same range, but the eastern mates in winter and western mates in the summer, and so there's no way for them to reproductively mate. They're reproductively isolated because of time, the preferred time for their reproduction. This is a great example of behavioral isolation. So when certain behavioral patterns or rituals or trends isolate a species. Um, for example, courtship or mating rituals. So in the blue-footed boobies mate only after a courtship display unique to their species. So um, they can't really interbreed because this specific courtship dance and display is required for reproduction to occur, and only those of that population are able to perform it correctly and so attract mates. Another good example, mechanical isolation or morphological differences, so can prevent successful mating. So even like in these plants, even in closely related species of plants, the flowers often have really certain appearances that attract different pollinators. Um, And in this specific picture, these are two species of monkey flowers, and they really are different in shape and color. Therefore, they aren't ever cross-pollinated because the same pollinators don't visit both plants. So mechanical isolation, something about physically reproductive structures make them incompatible with one another or their pollinators. Another example from the animal world, for many insects, male and female sex organs of closely related species don't fit together. So it prevents that reproduction. Obviously, if they can't fit together to reproduce, that is an example of reproductive isolation. And lastly, gametic isolation, when sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another. So here in sea urchins, they release sperm and eggs into the surrounding water where they fuse and form zygotes. Gametes of different species of red and purple physiologically can't fuse, and so they can never hybridize, and so they remain separate species. Gametic isolation. And then lastly, there are kind of three forms of what's called post-zygotic barriers. So it prevents hybrid offspring, even if uh, reproduction occurs. Post-zygotic barriers prevent hybrid offspring from developing into viable fertile adults that are able to reproduce. And so these three are examples of those barriers that prevent this from happening. So one is what's called reduced hybrid viability. So genes of different parent species may interact and impair the hybrid's development. So in this example, uh, a certain species of salamander, they may interbreed, but most of the hybrids don't completely develop, and those that do never survive to sexual maturity. So even though they are able to produce hybrid offspring, those hybrid offspring are impaired or unable to reach sexual maturity to reproduce. There's also what's called reduced hybrid fertility. So even if hybrids are vigorous and they end up growing into functional adults, they may be sterile. So this is an example with the ligers. Lions and tigers can interbreed and hybridize and create offspring that can grow to maturity, but they can never reproduce. So sometimes chromosomes of the parents may differ in number or structure, and then meiosis in hybrids may not end up producing normal gametes that could make a new organism. So for example, with mules and donkeys and horses. So horses have 64 chromosomes, so they have 32 pairs. And donkeys have 62 chromosomes with 31 pairs. And we get a mule by crossing a horse and a donkey. And so a mule is a hybrid, but they have 63 chromosomes. Um, like you can see, mules, of course, are vigorous and they can be strong and healthy, but they're sterile because of the reduced hybrid fertility. And so that's why horses and donkeys are different species, even though they can interbreed and make vigorous offspring, because that vigorous offspring can't reproduce. And then lastly, what's called hybrid breakdown. So hybrids may be fertile and viable in first generation, but when they mate, offspring are feeble or sterile or aren't able to reproduce. So uh, as a really cool example, in strains of cultivated rice, hybrids are really vigorous, but plants in the next generation are small and sterile, um, and on separate path to separate species. So this is an example, especially in the rice growing world, that could be really important. So if we just go back and kind of look at what we've talked about prezygotic and postzygotic barriers to create reproductive isolation and how each of those can be classified as allopatric or sympatric mechanisms based on how that isolation is achieved.